Digital Foundry is proudly sponsored by Omen's new wireless range of mice, keyboards and headsets.
Nvidia GeForce RTX 3080. It's here and it's fast, very fast. It's also the most power-hungry GPU I've seen from Nvidia, certainly across the last few generations where I've been looking at graphics technology more closely. But that's the price for often brutal performance, and it's this that necessitates the look and feel of the Founders Edition products we have for review today. Now, as you know, I've already had an early look at RTX 3080 and I was able to bring you preliminary performance numbers stacked up against RTX 2080. But the selection of titles was narrow and we were limited to 4K resolution in the testing. However, these results established that we would be looking at an extremely fast product, capable of some impressive gen-on-gen leaps, but in this extended review we're going to be diving deeper into the capabilities of this card. We've got more games tested than we've ever done before, and we ran all of that analysis at 1080p, 1440p and 4K resolutions. All of that data is on Eurogamer.net. But we're also going to be looking a bit at power consumption, and we'll also be taking a closer look at ray tracing. But stuff like AI upscaling via DLSS and a deeper dive into the RT side of things in general, well, that's a job better suited to my colleague Alex Battaglia, so look out for that if his schedule permits. I've already shared my thoughts on the new Founders Edition card, but to quickly recap, it's an impressive piece of industrial design. Feels almost Apple-like in the hand. 320 watt TGP on this up against the 225 watts of the RTX 2080 Founders card. And that means that as well as architectural improvements, a big chunk of extra performance is coming through sheer brute force power from the mains, requiring an innovative dual fan solution. It's what Nvidia calls a flow-through design with independent push and pull fans. The idea is to deliver a cooler, quieter card that's actually handling a ton more power than the last generation equivalent. Here's how the RTX 3080 spec checks out against RTX 2080 and 2080 Ti. It's always a bit tricky comparing specs when architectures change, but you can see where the transistor density offered by the 8nm Samsung processor's gone. The CUDA core count hits a massive 8,704, Nvidia promising a doubling of floating point compute performance gen on gen. And new GDDR6X memory provides a big leap in bandwidth. You will note, however, that boost clock remains pretty much the same between 2080 and 3080. More power, more compute and more bandwidth is how Nvidia is getting the job done here, in combination with architectural improvements that, amongst other things, deliver a promised 2x leap in ray tracing performance. Ports-wise, we're missing the USB-C virtual link from the 20 series, but we're retaining 3 display ports and the HDMI spec has been upgraded to version 2.1, meaning that you can hook up 30 series cards to 4K 120Hz displays and even those that operate at 8K at 60Hz. Something I really want to check out, especially as Nvidia is promising a new DLSS performance mode that scales from even lower resolutions, opening the door to 8K gaming. A couple of further points on the spec. There's no NV-Link here, so no multi-GPU functionality on the 3080, and the power socket there, it's a single 12-pin design. Nvidia is looking to standardize it, but in the meantime, until appropriate power supply cables are available, you're going to be needing to use this little adapter here. Not exactly perfect for those aesthetically pleasing PC builds, but you know, bottom line is that 2 8-pin power inputs from your power supply will do just fine. So if I'm quickly skirting over specifications and whatnot, it's because the proof of the pudding here really is in the tasting, and I really want that to be the focus of this video. It's all about what you're actually getting for your money and what the upgrade experience looks like. So yes, we will be comparing to 2080 and 2080 Ti, but I actually think it's the users on 10 series Pascal cards that really should be looking at this. I mean, 20 series cards have the next-gen features you'll need, like hardware-accelerated ray tracing, and in my opinion anything from 2060 Super up is still an excellent product. So yeah, 20 series is still pretty potent, but in the course of my testing I found several examples where 10 series Pascal cards, even the mighty 1080 Ti, aren't quite cutting it anymore on select games. Anyway, performance, there's a ton to get through, so bear with me on this. First of all, we should talk about PCI Express 3.0, which is what my Intel-based test system uses, versus PCI Express 4.0, supported by RTX 3080, which offers extra bandwidth, but is only currently supported on Ryzen systems. So we did some tests here using the area in Horizon Zero Dawn that caused Alex so many PCI Express related problems during his PC Tech review, and we saw some curious results. Configuring his Ryzen 3900X system to render the scene with PCIe 3.0 bandwidth versus 4.0, we did see a drop to performance, as you can see here. First impressions then, we should probably bench 4K on the Ryzen setup. However, we repeated that test on the Core i9-10900K and got the exact same result as the Ryzen setup at max bandwidth. Exact same result as the Ryzen setup. In fact, curiously, it actually ran 1 or 2 frames per second faster on the 10900K. I decided to stick with the Intel system as we're going to be doing a lot of 1080p and 1440p testing, where I would expect the Intel system to offer more of an advantage versus Ryzen, simply due to increased CPU performance at lower resolutions. But I'll certainly be interested to see how other outlets' Ryzen versus Core comparisons pan out, that's for sure. Anyway, with a new driver in place, I went back and reviewed the percentage differential numbers we published in the first look, which had a 4K ultra focus on 2080 versus 3080, and they hold up. Nothing has really changed. But there's one aspect of the Doom Eternal bench that looks kind of crazy, and it's at this exact point. When the action moves to the exterior scene, RTX 3080 almost doubles performance versus 2080. Now this is where the scrutiny of the community paid off, because if we run the comparison again with textures reduced to ultra, which is still pretty immense, the 3080's 87% advantage with the review driver drops to 76% versus 2080. Still a colossal increase, but it's important to show the full extent of the boost, which came from both VRAM allocation and the new Ampere architecture, and we can isolate the difference there. So yeah, we got some comments from some sections of the PC hardware press, but as I said, healthy skepticism is an essential in this job, and so is taking on board valid feedback. So yeah, we'll be returning to Doom Eternal later. First up, we're going to be primarily focusing on 4K benchmarks because I think that's the best place for this GPU, but the question is really how much it's worth it if you're running at 1080p or 1440p. This is mostly going to come down to your individual CPU setup. I'm using a Core i9-10900K with all 10 cores and 20 threads locked to 5 GHz, pretty much the optimal gaming CPU. Gears 5 at 1080p, for example, on Ultra. Even with my CPU, there's just an 18% uplift going from 2080 to 3080, and this rises to a more impressive 49% at 1440p. Far Cry 5 at 1080p, 2080 versus 3080, just a 10% increase, rising to 38% at 1440p. Now all of our benchmarks at 1080p, 1440p and indeed 2160p, 4K, they are published on Eurogamer, but suffice to say we've reached the point now where advances in GPU performance are outstripping CPU. IPC boosts from AMD and Intel would be nice, but I still think we need to be asking developers to more fine-tune their engines for the many-core era. Doom Eternal is noted for being super optimal in CPU threading. At 1080p, the game gives us a 53% advantage, moving from 2080 to 3080, rising to 71% at 1440p. And on that latter point, we're very close to the boost given at 4K, once VRAM issues are removed from the equation. The point is, RTX 3080 has reached a performance level where it really demands that you push for insanely hard GPU workloads to get the most from it. Which brings me back to the 3080 first look and the big question of whether this is Nvidia's biggest gen-on-gen improvement. What I found is that games essentially slot into 3 categories. There's the super performers, most of which, perhaps inevitably, were featured in the first look, where Nvidia had the choice of the games. Then there's the more typical performers, basically the mode average if you like, the most common gen-on-gen gain if you like. Finally, there are the games that I consider to be performance outliers. A selection of titles are tested where performance increases fell a little bit short. But before we dig into the numbers, I do think that the gen-on-gen marketing is kind of missing the point. As I said, if you bought a 20 series GPU, I think you're set for the foreseeable future. Only the RTX 2060 with its 6 gigs of VRAM has ever really given me pause. 30 series is obviously a ton faster, but it doesn't make 20 series obsolete. The big story here is, as I said, the leap from Pascal 10 series. Now I'm using the GTX 1080 as the main gen-on-gen comparison point here. You'll get a gigantic improvement at 1440p, and at 4K you're looking at anything from 2x to 2.5x to 3x multiplication of performance depending on the game. Before we get onto the stats, one more explanation point. We've been struggling to get our heads around the validity of benchmarks for some time now. Years, in fact. We've made videos about it. The point is that the results you can get vary very much on what you're testing at any given point. Now, we've got a companion video to this one going up imminently, if not now, that concentrates on Flight Simulator 2020, 2080 Ti versus 3080. 3080 is always faster, but the extent of its lead varies on a scenario by scenario based nature. The benchmarks we have in this video are snapshots, if you like, of individual titles. Like for like tests, of course, but as we noted in the 3080 first look video with Shadow the Tomb Raider, different scenarios offer up different performance boosts. If I were buying a new GPU, I would be looking at a plurality of reviews and datasets to get a bigger picture. But with that, let's dig in. I'll start first of all with what I named the super performers. The Ampere architecture ramps up FP32 compute to an almost staggering level. Now, compute is just one part of a GPU setup, but we're seeing mostly modern engines produce some pretty amazing results, and the best result of all, I kinda didn't expect it to be this one. Borderlands 3 DX12 is the best result I've seen on its badass settings at DX12 at 4K. Frame rates on 3080 range from 55 to 70 frames per second, and you can see on the graphing here that nothing else gets close. At its best 2080 Ti it's 51 FPS, 2080 38 FPS. Let's break down the performance differentials. I measure an 81% improvement moving from 2080 to 3080 and a 37% boost from 2080 Ti to 3080. But, perhaps not surprisingly, a potential upgrade from GTX 1080 sees the biggest boost. You get a 2.5 times increase to performance at 4K. So are we looking at a VRAM limitation here skewing the results as we saw to a certain extent on Doom Eternal? Well, even at 1080p, there's still a 64% increase moving from 2080 to 3080, which must surely rule that out. An impressive opener then, and moving on to the next super performer, Doom Eternal is simply epic on the 3080 to the point where Nvidia was happy to release a trailer of id Software's own performance improvements moving from 2080 Ti to 3080. So yeah, the lead engine programmer Billy Kahn confirmed to me that this was the same system with just the GPU switched, and there are some big increases here. Doom Eternal on 3080 runs so fast that I think it would look and feel great on a 4K high refresh rate screen with VRR to smooth out the experience overall. Bottom line though, as I said, even with the VRAM limit removed, 3080 is still 77% faster than 2080 in this bench sequence and 34% faster than 2080 Ti, which remember has more memory than the 3080. But again, it's the gen-on-gen boost that is most significant. GTX 1080, again another 8GB card, and I've got the benchmark here with texture pool allocation dropped to Ultra to accommodate its lower memory. Well, you're still getting a 2.9x multiplier to performance. Remedies control, more big numbers. I've rationalized the benchmark sequence here to a continuous flow of the gameplay from the beginning of the title, easily repeatable. You're not hitting 4K 60 on the 3080, but that's a piece of cake if you enable DLSS, which I've not done for this test. You could even throw in the ray tracing too and get better performance than what you're seeing here. But regardless, in this rasterization analysis, Remedy's engine favours Ampere with a 75% gen-on-gen lead over 2080, with the 3080 delivering a 34% improvement over 2080 Ti at 4K resolution. Now, something rather odd happens at 4K with GTX 1080 in that the game runs really badly. 3080 delivers a 3.2 times multiplier in performance. It's almost like the game runs in slow motion on Pascal actually, but is it because we're overcommitting memory? Well, I'm not sure what we can rule out here, but the 2080 has the same amount of RAM, and its results suggest that memory isn't an issue. And even at 1440p, we're still seeing a 3 times improvement to frame rate comparing 1080 to 3080. It drops to 2.8 times multiplier at 1080p, which, still quite phenomenal. The final super performer in the lineup is Shadow the Tomb Raider. What I find fascinating about this one is that the 3 sections in the benchmark each deliver the kind of performance differentials between 2080 and 3080 that you'll see across a range of our other benchmarks. The jungle area is in super performer territory, while the first area breaks the 70% gen-on-gen boost barrier. However, the final area shifts lower to around a 65% gen-on-gen increase. So it's a good taster of the various challenges the game has, and stacking up the performance differentials between our test cards with the review driver, I now see a 71% gen-on-gen improvement between 2080 and 3080. This drops to a 31% boost comparing 3080 to 2080 Ti. But again, really, it's GTX 1080 where the increases are most remarkable. A 2.5 times multiplier to performance at 4K, 2.3 times at 1440p and 1.9 times at 1080p. So the big boosts here, it's going from Pascal to Ampere. Let's move to the other extreme now and look at games where the 3080 falls a bit short, or at least falls a bit short in this test segment. Death Stranding, first of all. You're still getting impressive gen-on-gen gains, 57.5% in this sequence, moving from 2080 to 3080. But this is clearly lower than the overall expectations set by the super performers. What's interesting here is that the boost from 2080 Ti to 3080 is just 25%. Still significant, but clearly off pace compared to what we've seen previously. Again though, when you look at the increase from GTX 1080, it's pretty insane. 2.3 times multiplier at 4K dropping to 2 times at 1440p. I'd love to have shown you the 1080p result, but the game kept crashing with access violation errors, which happened on 1080 Ti too. What's going on there? Perhaps inevitably, renowned GPU mangler Ghost Recon Wildlands at ultra settings also had issues, and while it holds the distinction of almost hitting 4K 60 for the very first time in our GPU tests, the bottom line is that it offered up a paltry 46.5% improvement moving from 2080 to 3080. That drops to just 20% versus 2080 Ti, again the lowest improvement I saw overall. The multiplier from GTX 1080 is also at its lowest too, at just 1.9x at 4K. I have to admit though, just saying that and describing it as a disappointment, kind of amusing, right? 20% faster than 2080 Ti, hundreds of dollars cheaper, and I'm disappointed. Still, Ghost Recon is here mostly because of its status as a kind of banana skin benchmark. We do expect it to perform badly. It always does. It never disappoints, not even here. Which leads me on to a moment of personal tragedy. This is the first GPU review in years that will not have Crysis 3 metrics, another one of my banana skin titles for GPU testing. This game is my first port of call on any new piece of hardware, owing to its somewhat unique properties. 2080 Ti won't run this at 4K 60 consistently, and I don't know if 3080 will either. Whether it's a driver issue or a Windows issue, Crysis 3 is balked, doesn't work properly. Performance maxes at just 65 frames per second, even at 900p. Now, I've informed Nvidia of the issue and I pray that it will be fixed. I'll be praying to the Crysis shrine, in fact. Just doesn't feel like a proper GPU review without this one. Thing is, other CryEngine games seem to be affected, like Rise Son of Rome, which also has a weird frame rate cap. So look, what's the big deal? I'm sure there's a lot of folks out there watching this review not quite understanding why we're testing games like Crysis 3 or Assassin's Creed Unity, because who's still playing them, right? Thing is, when you buy a new GPU, it's got to work on all of your games, regardless of their vintage. And the key thing about being a PC gamer is a library, access to that library that's literally decades old. We've got to ensure that those games still work just as they should. That's what I think anyway. And yeah, AC Unity, another banana skin game from back in the day, and for my money still an incredible experience on PC. One that I ideally hope will get a proper remaster at some point, but a game that was really forward-looking for its day and a definite GPU destroyer of its time. This is where we move into the scalability territory that I found most common with RTX 3080. Compared to 2080, the new card delivers a 66% improvement to 4K performance in our test sequence, and with a 96 frames per second average, we finally have a GPU that masters AC Unity almost 6 years after its launch. The overall average versus 2080 Ti is 30%, another creditable result. I think it's just really impressive how the 3080 delivers a big chunk of extra performance over a card that's still overkill for many gaming scenarios. Up against the old GTX 1080, you're getting a 2.3 times multiplier to performance that drops to 2 times at 1440p and 1.6 times at 1080p. I thought I'd bring in some new blood to the GPU testing for the new generation of cards, and I'd heard that Dirt Rally 2 was a huge performer, and this is indeed the case. The benchmark sequence is an entire stage from the game, and the RTX 3080 hits a 78.5 average at 4K on max settings with both TAA and 8 times multi-sampling anti-aliasing enabled. Pretty incredible stuff, but the truth is, it runs great on all cards. Anyway, gen on gen at 4K you're getting 66% of extra performance on average, which is kind of ballpark for a lot of the titles I've tested. Interestingly though, the boost from RTX 2080 Ti is fairly less impressive than other titles at 24%, and that drops to 17% at 1440p. Again though, if you factor in an upgrade path that's actually more probable, the boost up against GTX 1080 is impressive, a 2.3x boost to performance that drops to 2x at both 1440p and 1080p. Gains are also a touch more conservative with Metro Exodus running at ultra settings. I mean, the benchmark sequence follows 4A Games' proud tradition of being a big stress test that is more impactful on GPU than most, if not all, of the actual game, but it's still delivering a 69.5 frames per second average across the whole bench at 4K maxed. However, with that said, the gen-on-gen increase, 2080 to 3080, comes in at 61%, which tracks lower than the overall average that I was expecting. Again, looking at 2080 Ti versus 3080, the increase here is 24%, so worthwhile but not immense. I also wanted to test Gears 5 as this is an interesting title for a number of reasons, principally because I've seen a 2-week port of this game benchmarked on RDNA 2 Xbox Series X, where its 52 compute units at 1.825 GHz deliver a score just beneath RTX 2080. A score that may well improve when we consider that the Coalition are likely to put a lot more than just 2 weeks into the port. Anyway, up against RTX 2080 you're getting a fairly standard 61% improvement to performance across the whole benchmark run at Ultra HD resolution. A bit lower than expected actually, trending just below the overall average to performance I'm seeing across the board. However, the overall average up against RTX 2080 Ti is a little more conservative at 27%. Again though, I still think the more probable upgrade path of GTX 1080 to RTX 3080 is where the improvement is most dramatic. There's a 2.2 times improvement to performance in effect on this benchmark run. So that's quite a big performance roundup, right? Well, we're not done yet. If we find the time, we're going to take more of a look at the DLSS and ray tracing performance of Ampere. But I did run some more numbers to get a grip on this 2 times multiplier to ray tracing performance that Nvidia is claiming. I've run all of the following benchmarks at 1440p, and I've done so without DLSS. Now, my hope is that when AMD's RT-enabled cards arrive, we can do some like-for-like comparisons with what I really hope to be competitive hardware. But regardless, Quake 2 RTX, well, it's Vulkan based, it's not using DXR, and AMD would need to wrap Nvidia extensions into their driver to get this one running, and I hope they do. Or perhaps more likely, maybe some enterprise encoder, perhaps at AMD, can replace the Nvidia extensions with the Vulkan certified equivalents. This game is open source after all. But to get to the main point here, path tracing, total ray tracing, this is an incredible workout for the technology, and as per my first look video, the boost to performance is excellent. This particular recorded demo is more of a stress test for the game than the one I featured earlier, covering off reflections and transparencies in a way my first demo didn't. The result is actually a small improvement in the test result, a 94% boost for the 3080 up against 2080, and a still creditable 47% boost over the output of the RTX 2080 Ti. Most games are still hybrid renderers though, where you should expect to see results that are lower but still significant. I've isolated Alex Battaglia's Corridor of Doom from Remedy's control here, the aim being to focus more on this game's ray tracing performance. Expect the averages to shift lower across the overall run of play as they did in the first look, but in RT intensive areas like this one, the 3080 delivers 87% more performance than 2080 and a creditable 43% boost over RTX 2080 Ti. There's also a really nice result when running Metro Exodus flat out at ultra settings with its brilliant RT global illumination, also operating at the Overkill Ultra preset, in what is already an extremely demanding workout even in its basic rasterization version. The bottom line is that the RTX 3080 gets the job done with a 74% sized slice of extra performance gen on gen up against 2080. Also interesting to see that the slightly lackluster 23% increase in frame rate from RTX 2080 Ti in rasterization mode is increased to 29% when RT is enabled. So I thought I'd end with a look at the first big RT release, Battlefield 5, with a stomp through this level from the single player campaign. It's all about the puddles here, folks, but regardless, it's interesting to see a less impressive boost overall. You still get an extra 57% of frame rate comparing 3080 to 2080, dropping to 26% against RTX 2080 Ti. But it's a result that demonstrates that you're going to be getting very different results depending on the title, how its ray tracing is implemented, and quite possibly a whole host of other factors. Okay, so this has been a bit of an epic review, and well, I want to draw it to a close by talking about power consumption. Nvidia makes big claims here, a 1.9 times performance per watt improvement over the 20 series Turing architecture. And at the same time, AMD is claiming a 50% improvement in efficiency for its new RDNA 2 cards versus RDNA 1. But the implication is that you're getting either a huge improvement in efficiency, lower power draw, or alternatively, a huge improvement to performance. But when you actually get your new GPU, you're not, are you? And this is because the higher you clock a processor, the less efficient it becomes, but the more performant it becomes, and we all want those high clocks for maximum performance, right? So Nvidia provided press with what it calls PCAT, an interposer PCI Express board for measuring PCI Express power from the motherboard slot, along with a secondary board that monitors power input direct from the power supply. There's a USB interface to connect to PC, and you can see all of the actual power consumption in real time. You can log it and whatnot. It's pretty awesome stuff. It's early days for me with this kit, so I kept the tests simple. I ran static scenes from key games, measured frame rate and power draw. So how many watts does it take to render a single frame? Lower is better here, obviously. On the plus side, the 3080 is clearly more efficient than Turing and delivers a lot more performance, but on the minus side, some of the gains can look rather low. So in this scene in Doom Eternal, the RTX 2080 Ti's wattage per frame is only 5% higher than 3080's. The RTX 2080's is closer to 20% though. For GTX 1080, delivering a frame requires 52% more power. So the real efficiency gains, the big ones, the ones you'll actually notice, they're versus Pascal. Here's the interesting one though, I guess. I also tried the Radeon RX 5700 XT, a Navi card on 7nm, and found that it required 27.6% more power to deliver the same scene. This is all rather tricky though, because obviously games that favour AMD hardware will see the gap close radically. So, for example, factor out DLSS and the extra power required to deliver a frame in Death Stranding drops to 15%. On the flip side, looking at Gears 5, RX 5700 XT requires an extra 30% of wattage to deliver a frame up against RTX 3080. So yeah, I'm not an expert here, this is just my first take. Power efficiency, measuring it, it's a tricky business. Results are going to change on a per game basis. They'll change according to what tasks the GPU is doing and what architecture they're running them on. With that said though, the overall conclusion I take away from the numbers is that the 320 watt power limit on the 3080 is needed to deliver a meaningful performance boost over the Turing cards with lower power budgets. The big efficiency saving, and indeed performance boost, comes up against Pascal. So let's wrap up then. The question I looked at in the 3080 first look was whether or not this is Nvidia's biggest generational leap. There were some big numbers, a tremendous improvement to the experience of playing a 4K game, and it's clearly a much faster card than the 2080 while delivering an impressive amount of extra performance over 2080 Ti, a card that costs hundreds of dollars more. But it seems that Ampere runs best on the most modern game engines, while others don't quite show the same stratospheric leap in performance. But what you are getting is a circa 65% uplift on average, and that is on par with the kind of numbers I saw when I reviewed GTX 1080 and compared it against 980. And that product went on to become a classic. So this is a big deal, especially when you factor in some tremendous looking improvements to ray tracing performance as well. But Pascal also delivered astonishing efficiency improvements. A GTX 1070 outperformed Titan X Maxwell, and it did it using a lot less power, and that's what you aren't getting this time around. Now, for a $700 GPU, I don't think power consumption is likely to have much of an impact on the purchasing decision, but there it is. It's the only real criticism I can level at what is a powerful product with excellent levels of performance, delivered at an enticing price point. And yeah, it does throw down the gauntlet to AMD. And we'll have to wait until the tail end of October to see what they have cooking. But that's all from me for now. Please do like and subscribe if you enjoyed the content. Ring the bell for instant notifications, and as always, if you love what we do, if you want to support the DF team more directly, please consider our Patreon, where you can grab everything we do as pristine quality video downloads. But that's all from me for now. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of this particular marathon, and just generally, thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.
Featuring its new Warp wireless technology, Omen's PC peripherals allow for lag-free gaming. From the 360-degree audio of its Omen frequency headphones, the 180-hour battery life of the Vector mouse, and the 2.4 GHz connection of its Spacer keyboard, Omen has you covered for the ultimate wireless experience.